I think it's about time to get back to this series, don't you think? Let's see what's going on at the complicated entropic heart of Catch 33. Come on, it'll be fun. When I started the series, I was doing like 3 songs in a single video, but that's because the songs were much shorter and they would play with a million different versions of the same riff, so it made sense to talk about them all together. That won't quite work for this monster of a track. This video will be about just the first minute and a half, which is really just 2 riffs, but there's so much to talk about that I think it would be foolish to try to get more of the track in one video. This first chunk that I'm talking about today is united by a single relatively short rhythmic pattern, which goes 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 3, all in 16th notes. In the first riff, we get guitar attacks at different pitches on each of these. And in the second, every second attack is a rest, and the rest are just the open string. This string lasts for 21 16th notes and would actually sit nicely as like a compound septuple meter thing, that is 7 beats lasting for 3 16ths each. That would sound like this. But of course this is Meshuggah, so instead this 21/16 thing phases against a quarter note beat, by which I mean that the guitar pattern moves relative to the beat. Because this pattern deals in 16th notes and there are an odd number of them before it repeats, it will move by 1/16th note relative to the beat each time it repeats and line back up again with the beat every 4 iterations. Here's that super slow. This is already pretty tricky to really wrap your ears around and play accurately on its own with a metronome. I know it's not too hard to like hear it, whatever that means, but trust me, it's pretty tricky to play this without the recording, accurately at least. If you don't believe me, give it a shot on your own. I also want to make a quick detour that will maybe be completely misunderstood, but hearing this guitar pattern in relation to the quarter note is not the same thing as hearing the passage in 4/4. I think a lot of people, when they say, I hear it, it's all in 4/4, it's easy to hear, they're either just listening to the drums and listening to that kick, kick, snare, kick, or cymbal, cymbal, snare, cymbal, and completely ignoring the guitar pattern, or they are hearing the quarter note, so like you can tap your foot and play the guitar riff, boom, 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 boom. Bum 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 bum, you know, like that. So I'm tapping my foot. But the thing is, when I'm tapping my foot, I'm not grouping those taps into 4. So I'm not actually doing anything that shows that I'm hearing the 4/4. I'm not saying that it's impossible to actually hear this in 4/4 and actually count to 4 with those taps while you're doing the also keeping track of the guitar riff. I'm just saying I think it's a lot more complicated to say that this music is all in 4/4 than what people seem to think it is. But that's deserves its own much more complicated video, and there's some people actually working on academic articles about like really getting into the details of what it might mean to hear in 4/4 as opposed to hearing switching back and forth between hearing 2 things as opposed to hearing just with the beat or whatever. But moving on with the analysis, there are also some cool things around the hypermetric boundaries here. If you remember from all of Meshuggah's music ever, sections tend to change after groups of 4 or 8 or 16 measures of 4/4. The same is true here, but with a fancy modification that I don't think you hear as much in their earlier stuff, but has become a bigger part of their writing in the last couple albums. Basically, they kind of elide this boundary. It's still there, and it still means the same thing, and it's still in the same place, but the guitars don't mark it in the big obvious way that they normally do. Instead of rigidly repeating one riff until it gets chopped off by the boundary and then starting the next riff right away, they start the next riff a little early here. No riffs get harmed in this particular hypermetric boundary. Let's get into the details here a little more. We have this rhythmic pattern lasting for 21/16 notes, which happens 12 times for the first riff. This means a total of 63 quarter notes, one shy of a hypermetric boundary. So 64 beats would be 16 measures of 4/4. The next riff starts right away after these 12 iterations of the first pattern, anticipating the hypermetric boundary by an entire quarter note. But don't go thinking that they messed up or anything. It's not like they actually drop a beat at all. The 4/4 meter keeps going uninterrupted, and the next hypermetric boundary, pretty far down the line, is in the right place, and it's marked in the more usual way for them. It's just that they're letting stuff flow a little more smoothly over this boundary instead of forcing the change of riff to happen right at the exact moment that you finish 16 measures like they normally do. They let the guitar patterns kind of run their course more. Think of this thing as being kind of like how good jazz rhythm sections will have the chord changes absolutely rigid and solid in their ears and their playing, but because they know everyone is on the same page, no one needs to make such a big deal about them all the time. You can let other ideas kind of skate over the top of them. Just a fun little detail from this album, and something that they started doing more often in Obscene Colossus and Violent Sleep of Reason. Alright, so that is rhythm and hypermeter and meter. Let's talk about pitch. Where the entropy and almost patterns come in, which is this thread that we've been tracing for the last few Catch 33 videos, is in the pitches in this first riff. The entropy angle is kind of obvious. There's no actual repeating pitch pattern. Instead, there's an apparently random sequence of alternations between a low pitch from F sharp to A and a high pitch somewhere between E and G. I've been framing these forays into patternlessness as entropic, and I've been claiming that we've been trending more towards this sort of thing in the last few tracks of the album. This pitch entropy is one of many concentrated examples of this on this track. But the thing is, as often happens, we can't quite say that what the pitches are doing is entirely patternless, even if it doesn't have any literal repetition scheme. And what's really cool, and probably something kind of obvious to anyone who's tried to memorize this part on guitar, is that the patterns show up in a really cool way on the fretboard that only really makes sense visually. Basically, for almost all the iterations of this 8-note pattern, if we know the first 4 notes, we can figure out the last 4 notes, because they tend to draw X's on the fretboard. Or maybe if you want a fancy way of saying this, which I don't know why you wouldn't, we could call this pattern spatially chiastic, after the Greek letter chi, which looks like an X. Here's the first iteration. It goes like this, and then like this, and then crosses both those initial lines. In the second iteration, it's the same sort of idea, but first we complete a big X, and then we complete a smaller X kind of inside that bigger X. The third one makes the same X's as the first one, but in a different order. And the fourth one scrambles this order in a different way. The The fifth one scrambles the order of the second one. Etc. Here are the X's from the whole section. There are clearly some constraints on what types of pitches show up in these cells. The pitches consistently alternate between something on the low 8th string and something higher on the 6th string, and they're all on frets 1 through 4, and they all tend to make these X's on the fretboard. Are there bigger patterns though? The answer, as it always seems to be in regard to this question on this album, is kind of. Several of these patterns are inverted versions of each other. So for example, the first, second, and third cells are presented in a sort of inverted way and in reverse order in the 4th, 5th, and 6th cells. Then the next 3 cells present the 3rd, 4th, and 5th cells again, now in retrograde order. So instead of going 3rd cell, 4th cell, 5th cell, it goes 5th cell, 4th cell, 3rd cell. Some tantalizing stuff, which seems to hint even more strongly at some sort of deeper systematic organization than what I've talked about so far. But of course, nothing is complicated in such a simple way in Catch 33. The patterns don't quite fit. For one, the inversions I mentioned are not quite exact. The rules to get from one to another are not the same in each case. To invert the first cell to get to the 4th cell, for example, we switch the upper fret and lower frets, but also change the order of the pairs. Going from the 2nd to the 5th, on the other hand, the order stays the same. I also can't find any neat way of describing what's happening in the last 3 cells. It seems like they just kind of reuse the 1st, 4th, and 6th cells. Eric Smielek, who wrote his master's thesis about Catch 33, which by the way is something you should absolutely read, not just for his analysis of some of these complicated sections, but even more for his analysis of genre and meaning for fans, says this about this section. Quote, rather than merely being a compositional curiosity, this symmetry strongly begs the question of how much of Meshuggah's patterning can be attributed to the kind of real-time experimentation with fretboard shapes that rock guitarists commonly use when writing at their instruments, and how much of it implies a kind of puzzle-like compositional strategy that the members of Meshuggah have at times denied in interviews. I think of it kind of like this. It's like the band has a variable labeled entropy when they're writing these riffs, and it's on a little knob. And if you turn it all the way up, you get some of this stuff in their EPI. And when it's all the way down, you get some of the really repetitive, orderly riffs that we've heard a few times on this album. It feels like what they do for this riff, and if you like it though, is turn it up just enough that there are no overarching patterns, but there are some rigid constraints on the randomness, and the apparent randomness actually has a lot of hints at patterns. It's like having the static on the TV and tuning it just a little so you start to see pictures and shapes, but it's not enough that you can actually get the whole picture. I've kind of hit this point before in this series, but I think it's central to the album, so I'll reiterate. I think this kind of constitutive dance between randomness and chaos, meaning and nonsense, order and entropy, is one of the key motivating drives on this album. Not only do we get some entropic riffs and some orderly riffs and get to enjoy that contrast, but riffs like this first one in Death is Death manage to be both random and calculated at the same time. see you next week for more Catch 33.